and good morning to friends in Africa, Middle East, Europe, and North America. My name is Deepak Mishra. I'm the Director and Chief Executive of ICRIER. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the first in a series of 4 webinars on reforming the WTO for the 21st century, organized by ICRIER in partnership with the India Office of CAS, Germany. If you type the word WTO into your internet search engine, it is likely that the engine will prompt you to complete it with the following phrases. I tried this today morning: in crisis, in existential crisis, in midlife crisis, in trouble, in deadlock, and so on and so forth. You get my drift. A New York Times editorial column in December 2020 said, if WTO were a person, it would be that dude at the bar drinking the afternoon away in his business suite and wondering where did it all went wrong. It then goes on to write that reforming the WTO requires soul searching about what went wrong and what can be done to fix it. The very issue that will be at the heart of our discussion in this webinar series. But first, a bit of a historical context. It's not widely recognized that WTO is the first multilateral institution created after the collapse of the former Soviet Union. In a sense, it is a child of a unipolar world that we had at that point of time. At its inception, WTO was popular, it was powerful, it was ambitious, and some would even say it was dreaded. There are countless trade experts who tell their clients in the government, don't do this, it will run foul with the WTO. But then things have started to unravel in the past few years. The appellate body crisis has made the dispute settlement system drift from its original design. The negotiating functions of the WTO has considerably weakened. And in recent years, the global trade landscape has dramatically changed with rising protectionism and growing China-US trade frictions, posing new challenges to the WTO. Moreover, at the same time, the world has witnessed the emergence of new areas such as e-commerce, digital trade, digital payment platforms, and so on, which WTO in its current form is ill-equipped to handle. And finally, COVID has posed a fresh blow to the WTO system. Vaccine nationalism, unwillingness to temporarily dilute intellectual property provisions for production and distribution of vaccines, and the risk that some of the provisions in the stimulus package in many countries could play foul with the WTO rules are some of the examples of how COVID has also created new challenges for the WTO. In short, WTO, some would say, has become much less effective and perhaps much less relevant than what it was a few years ago. Against this backdrop, the webinar series aims to highlight and discuss key areas of reform to strengthen the effectiveness of WTO and adapt it to a changing world. It will bring together, as it is going to do today, experts from government, academia, civil service, private sector, and international development organizations around the world to engage on a wide array of issues related to this subject. Reforming WTO remains an important priority for the government of India. While India is in the midst of starting to negotiate several, the multilateral trading system is unwavering. And India has and can play a pivotal role in reforming the WTO by bringing together member nations on one platform for foundation. With the mission to link India with the world, ICRIER has been a flag bearer of free and fair trade since after the establishment in 1995. ICRIER has successfully completed, in partnership with the government and national and international organizations and multilateral institutions, several research studies that have been widely published. And that brings me to today's webinar, which will focus on identifying the key areas of concern, prioritizing them, and suggesting a possible approach to strengthen the WTO response to the economic realities and business practices of the 20th century. To do that, we have an excellent set of panelists and an outstanding moderator, Professor Rupa Chanda from IIM Bangalore, I'll let Professor Chanda introduce the panel. But let me end by extending our sincere thanks to KAS for supporting this very important initiative. Mr. Peter Rimmele is currently the resident representative of KAS office in India, and I request him to give his welcome remarks. Peter has a distinguished career as a German civil servant. He has worked as a jurist. He has served in various capacities in East Timor, Indonesia, Rwanda, and Lebanon. It gives me great pleasure to invite Peter to give his work. So with that, let me thank the audience for their kind attention and hand over the floor to Peter.
Thank you, Deepak. Your Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a great privilege to welcome you all at another timely and pivotal webinar series initiated by ICRIER and the India office of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Through today's panelists, including His Excellency Mr. Bhatia, as well as Mr. Singh, we will undoubtedly gain vital first-hand insights into the workings, shortcomings, and remedies of the WTO. In addition, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Bercero and Mr. Draper, both of whom are not only experts in the field of international trade, but will certainly also providing us with their high-valued international perspectives on the subject. In our efforts now, the topic of WTO and its reform is not new to ICRIER, it's not new to us as Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Just before the pandemic, we had organized an Indian delegation for a visit to WTO and other multilateral organizations in Geneva, Brussels, just for addressing the issue of keeping up a rules-based order. It was led by the current G20 Sherpa of India, Suresh Prabhu, and so we are a little bit familiar with the challenges there. So let me also last, but by no means the least, to welcome Mrs. Anuradha, who as an experienced lawyer will most certainly be broadening our horizons with her inputs on the legal challenges and legal aspects of the potential WTO reforms. The WTO has become commonplace for all of us over the last decades. It did not emerge out of a vacuum. It was consciously built out of the lessons learned from the ravages of the Second World War. The multilateral trading system was explicitly designed for, and in the past greatly delivered on the promise of peace and economic prosperity fostered by trade. One thing is crystal clear: without cooperation in international economic relations, everyone is going to be worse off and chances for prosperity would be wasted. As consumers, we unconsciously benefit day in, day out from the safety and predictability of having access to goods and markets via a global regulatory framework. My core message is hence, the World Trade Organization is well worth being saved, even though it is ripe for our proposal for reforms, not only for the benefit of few individual countries, but for the good of the international community as a whole. Against this background, initiatives such as the present webinar series, which showcases experts' key propositions, concepts, and thoughts on the need reforms for the WTO, as well as concrete examples of their implementation, they are of paramount value. Ladies and gentlemen, let me share with you 3 short recommendations that I personally consider absolutely essential for overcoming the existential crisis that WTO is currently facing. With the ever-increasing rivalry, and we talk of a systemic rivalry nowadays between market-oriented and state-oriented economies that often hinders consensus building within the WTO, and since WTO agreements must mandatorily be reached on such a consensus basis, the way should be paved for new forms of reaching agreements within the WTO framework. And on the sideline, the same thing would be necessary for the EU also to come to decisions. If you continue like that, it will maybe also take forever to come to some thing people agree to. One possible idea to address this issue would involve plurilateral agreements. In this context, plurilateral negotiations should remain open and inclusive and allow non-participating developing countries to benefit from rules and market access. In order to ensure the primacy of the multilateral system, something we are all working for, all plurilateral agreements would of course have to be integrated into the scope of the WTO and not be signed outside its ambit. Hereby, the Trade and Investment Working Group could help by establishing a subcommittee to deal with plurilateral agreements and examine the criteria for success, monitoring, and integration into the WTO system. In addition, of course, incentives to prevent free riders would have to be implemented. Closely related to the above challenges is the exploitation of the WTO framework. Different regulatory regimes, to name only a few, exploited by some authoritarian countries such as China, enabling them to engage in state capitalism and market distorting practices such as subsidies, forced technology transfer, and an outright disregard for environmental standards. Such malpractices pose a major threat to world trade and therefore need to be addressed sooner rather than later. Therefore, in particular, the weaknesses in the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures need to be identified, and in the second step, plurilateral path towards a more comprehensive reform agenda need to be explored to remedy these loopholes and make progress on both fronts. There is also a need to address the crisis in the WTO's dispute settlement function, which is closely linked to the failure of its negotiating function. While the global trade landscape has changed dramatically in recent years, WTO rules seem to be stuck in the late 1990s, maybe early 2000s. A new set of regulation to deal with the ever-increasing digital trade and e-commerce sector will provide crucial in order to modernize the WTO and restore its role as an effective trade body. However, such reforms of modernization will not be possible without addressing another major bone of contention, namely the non-existent definition of criterion within the WTO of what is a developed versus a developing country. The practice of member countries being able to simply label themselves as developing countries in order to receive special and differential treatment needs to come to an end. I conclude here. These are my major recommendations, but I'm sure there will be other ones. It should be evident to all of us that positive change within the WTO is not possible without cooperation, collaboration, and consensus. Let me quote here the very timely words of former Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson, who stated that a peaceful world requires collective measures for the prevention of war, international cooperation to solve economic and social problems, and respect for human rights. And now, without further ado, I will pass the baton into the capable hands of Ms. Chanda, who will moderate this distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words. So thanks a lot for everyone being present here. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, I don't know, depending on wherever you are. I'm sure all of you are looking forward to this very timely and important webinar on formulating new approaches to strengthen the multilateral trading system. It's the first in a series of webinars, as Dr. Mishra has mentioned, which ICRIER is organizing on reforming the WTO in the 21st century. So just a little bit of context. I know we have heard about all the major issues already, as outlined very well by Mr. Rimmele. We know that over the last 75 years or so, we've benefited from a rules-based multilateral trading system. This has contributed to peace, security, and stability in the post-war world. The erstwhile GATT and later the WTO have also facilitated the integration of countries in global trade, with its consequent benefits in terms of growth and poverty alleviation. However, as the previous speakers have mentioned, ever since its inception in 2005, the WTO, which has been the cornerstone of this multilateral rules-based global trading system, has been facing challenges. So today we are really at a make or break point as the WTO faces an existential crisis. Its ability to deliver on all three of its key functions, which are: one, to provide a negotiating forum to liberalize trade and establish new rules; two, to monitor trade policies; and three, to resolve disputes among its members, are being questioned. Many factors have led to this crisis. For instance, the growing importance of beyond-the-border measures and domestic regulations in trade flows, the emergence of global businesses, which have made countries increasingly interdependent through value chains and trade investment linkages, emerging issues such as e-commerce and digital trade and Industry 4.0, alongside the lack of progress on long-standing issues from the Doha Development Round, differences among developed and developing countries, and formation of new geopolitical alliances and plurilateral groupings, which raise questions about the relevance and effectiveness of the WTO. Perhaps the nail in the coffin has been the paralysis of the WTO's dispute settlement system, which was previously called the jewel in the crown, and where there's no immediate solution in sight. COVID-19 has further compounded these challenges by disrupting global trade and the geo-economic equilibrium. We are witnessing a rise in protectionism, increased reliance on subsidies to revive economies in the aftermath of COVID, and growing calls for localization and self-reliance to mitigate the effects of global shocks. With all these challenges coming on the back of a failed Doha round and repeatedly missed deadlines, the future of the WTO is under threat. It is increasingly being recognized that the existing and emerging challenges of international trade in the 21st century require rules and regulations and a governance framework which reflect these changing realities. But will the WTO be able to negotiate new rules and tackle pressing issues amidst the changing global balance of power? Can negotiations be revived amidst disagreements on fundamental issues such as flexibilities for developing countries and the basic negotiating architecture and disciplines? Can the WTO's monitoring and deliberative function be revived and strengthened? Is the WTO capable of addressing pressing issues of sustainable development and the global commons? Can confidence and trust be revived in the multilateral trading system? And if so, how? Today's webinar will address these and many other issues that are confronting the WTO and which require urgent attention and resolution. Our panelists will present their insights and perspectives on the broader context, as well as specific challenges. So let me just mention to the audience how we plan to structure this webinar. There'll be 3 rounds of intervention. In the first 2 rounds, each panelist will provide his views on particular themes and issues he or she has chosen to address. These include the broader geopolitical context, the architecture and disciplines, the dispute settlement system, industrial subsidies, joint initiatives and plurilaterals, and special and differential treatment. In the third and final round, panelists will provide recommendations for reforms and specific proposals to address some of these challenges. So without further ado, let me turn to our panelists. We really have a galaxy of stars, I would say, in their own right. Our first speaker is Ambassador Ujal Bhatia. I think he really needs no introduction to this audience. He's currently an independent consultant and academic engaged in developing a policy framework for Indian agricultural investments overseas. From 2004 to 10, he was India's permanent representative to the WTO. He was an active participant during that period in the dispute settlement process, representing India in a number of dispute settlement cases as complainant and respondent. He also has adjudicatory experience, having served as a WTO dispute settlement panelist. Of course, he has served in various capacities as Joint Secretary in Indian Ministry of Commerce. He has vast knowledge and experience from the inside, and we're really looking forward to his intervention. So, Ambassador Bhatia, let me start with you to just lay out the broad context of what is ailing the WTO. And if you just put it in the geopolitical sort of perspective, where have things gone wrong? What are the main issues and debates which you think lie at the crux of the WTO's paralysis or existential crisis? And if I may add, if you could also touch upon, obviously, the dispute settlement body, the appellate system that has failed us. So over to you, Mr. Bhatia.
Thank you, Rupaji. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and with such a distinguished panel. There has been much talk of WTO reform among some members of the WTO in recent months. But there is as yet no common understanding on the what and how of WTO reform. The proposals being discussed so far differ very significantly in their direction and content and reflect few commonalities, highlighting the enormous difficulties in arriving at an agreed negotiating mandate for reform. In such a situation of undercooked debate, it is difficult to have a coherent discussion on the issue of WTO reform. With this caveat, I would like to put forward my understanding of why the WTO is in a crisis and what are the central issues involved in making the WTO fit for purpose for the 21st century. The GATT was a post-Second World War creation, which reflected the power structure as well as the patterns of global trade in that era. The Uruguay round was the last hurrah of that power structure, with its focus on broadening the remit of the organization and deepening the rules to facilitate globalization. With the emergence of China and others like India, as well as the unintended consequences of globalization, that era is over. The failure of the Doha round testifies to this. What the WTO needs to position it for the 21st century is deep changes which reflect new global priorities and the broader distribution of global economic power. So what are the ideas and assumptions we need to revisit? Let me list out a few which I consider the most important. First, the disciplines of the WTO rest on certain assumptions regarding the role of the state and of industrial policy. These assumptions are being challenged on two fronts. First, the state capitalism model pursued most visibly by China. And second, the emergence of nation-first policies among large WTO members like the United States, European Union, China, and India, usually being arguments like strategic autonomy and resilience. The recourse to the security exception under GATT Article 21 by the United States and others is an example of these challenges. The competitive spillovers of the massive fiscal expansions in the advanced economies in the context of the ongoing pandemic are another. Such policies raise serious questions about consistency with non-discrimination principles and the subsidy rules. These are not issues which the dispute settlement system can resolve. They are essentially political issues which go to the heart of the GATT-WTO foundational principles and must be addressed politically. The second issue is related to the first, and that is the interplay between WTO rules and threats to the global commons like climate change and public health. In the last several months, we have witnessed the devastating impact of export restrictions on global value chains related to vaccine inputs and treatments. Similarly, the proposal of India and South Africa for a TRIPS waiver is caught up in an increasingly sterile debate in the WTO. Regarding climate change, in the absence of multilateral disciplines for carbon border taxes, unilateral measures are bound to proliferate. And the European Union's CBAM, which is the first draft, of course, is an example of this. The threats to the global commons are, by definition, global threats and need to be addressed through clear multilateral rules. The WTO's continued relevance will depend on how effectively it addresses such issues. The third issue is the interplay between multilateralism and plurilateralism, something to which Mr. Rimmele referred. The era of the mega rounds and the single undertaking is over. But how do we design a multilateral system that interlocks with plurilateral or regional initiatives to provide equitable outcomes for all members of the WTO? India, for instance, has chosen to stay out of the various joint statement initiatives ongoing in the WTO. But with consensus around new multilateral initiatives difficult to achieve, such an approach risks the exclusion of all legitimate concerns in rulemaking in the WTO. And I'm sure Anuradha will have something to say about this. We need to consider how best to integrate plurilateral understandings into the corpus of multilateral rules under the WTO. Articles 9 and 10 of the Marrakesh Agreement provide a basis for such integration. The fourth issue is dispute settlement, which ironically was the best performing pillar of the WTO before the appellate body was disabled by a US veto. Till date, the United States has not clarified whether it supports the restoration of an appellate process. It is difficult to see how the WTO can remain relevant without an effective and independent two-tier dispute settlement system. The fifth issue, again, something which has been referred to, is special and differential treatment and self-designation of developing country status. This is turning out to be an extremely adversarial issue, but need not be if such matters are discussed in a constructive manner with focus on sectoral or on specific negotiations. Because all negotiations at the end of the day are give and take. At present, approaches to this issue are diametrically apart. The sixth issue is digital flows. Technology is ensuring that digital trade will overtake goods trade in the not too distant future. There are complex issues like data privacy, localization requirements, and the like, which need to be addressed to bring digital trade fully within the ambit of WTO rules. These discussions require to be conducted multilaterally to avoid multiplicity of rules and fragmentation of digital trade flows. The challenge is to devise a negotiating mandate which takes on board concerns of all members. This is already a heavy menu of things which require fixing. But without biting this bullet, it is difficult to see how the WTO can remain relevant. As a start, we need substantive proposals from all sections of the WTO membership for reform. The African group, India, and others furnished a paper in 2019 reflecting their reform priorities. Some other proposals are being discussed off campus. A serious debate has to begin within the WTO processes. The forthcoming ministerial meeting should be a good opportunity to begin this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia, for sharing and laying out the broad landscape of issues. It's really quite a complex array of challenges. So to follow up on that, we have Dr. Harshvardhan Singh. He is also well known to many of us. He was Deputy Director General at the WTO for 8 years. He has worked for over 3 decades on international trade policy, development, infrastructure regulation, and global governance. And from mid-1985 onwards, he worked in the GATT WTO Secretariat in Geneva for 12 years in divisions dealing with research, trade policy review, rules, etc. He's, of course, lectured at a variety of universities in the US and Asia. So, Dr. Singh, just to follow up on the broad landscape that Ambassador Bhatia has laid out before us, and there are so many complex issues and challenges facing the WTO. Please share with us your views regarding the fundamentals behind the different positions that the different countries have, the positions of the developed versus developing, the joint initiatives. So why do we see this kind of divergence of views and the existence of these different groupings that are at the heart of the WTO, kind of eroding the whole principle of multilateralism or a consensus-based approach to issues? So the broader question really is, can multilateralism really exist given this sort of divergence that is emerging? So your thoughts, please. Dr. Singh? Dr. Singh?
Yeah, yes. I got so taken in with the thoughts which you had and Ambassador Bhatia had generated. Thank you very much, Professor Rupa Chanda. And I must express my deep appreciation for, and in fact, even amazement at the succinctness with which Ambassador Bhatia has put forward so many different issues together. It was a very rich presentation, and so many different points came up. And coming to the question raised by you, Professor Chanda, you said, is a multilateral solution possible? That was the, if I recall, the way you ended in the context and in the background of such diverse kind of differences. So the differences actually are far more diverse in some way, because some terms like developing countries are used. There are no neat categories of developing countries. So there are national interests. Each country engages with the multilateral system, looking after the national interest. And to achieve a common solution to the extent possible, coming to a solution which causes the minimal or manageable discomfort. Because there is, when you are actually negotiating with another country with two different positions, even if you're negotiating positions just for the sake of starting the negotiations are different, to the extent you don't have a common meeting point, you have to reach a situation of landing zone where you actually can live with what is agreed, seeing that the common good, including your own good, can be achieved. And in that context, whether it's possible or not, my answer is yes. Whether it is possible in an easy way, I think Ambassador Bhatia's exposition shows it's extremely difficult. And what one has to do is to really try and see why the situation is the way it is. Many of these points have been beautifully and succinctly expressed by Ambassador Bhatia. So I will try and bring some of them together. Over time, so first of all, the differences were always there. It's not as if countries have negotiated with a common position all the time. Even the US and EU, when they negotiate, they don't necessarily have the same perspective or the same position where they'll want to land up. But they have to give and take in the negotiations. So just expand that a bit. Earlier, a lot of the so-called developing countries were allowed to continue to use policies which provided them flexibility in terms of the disciplines which were imposed. Therefore, those who took on the obligations basically had an agreement amongst them, and on the side, the others were given flexibilities to make them join the club. Today, if you have too many of these who need to take the obligations because of the so-called concept. Ambassador Bhatia talked about free riders, and before that also Mr. Rimmele talked about free riders. The free riders is, and this arises because of the most favored nation treatment condition of the WTO, that anything agreed amongst a small group is multilateralized by saying any obligation which I take vis-a-vis others is actually an obligation I'm taking vis-a-vis all the members of the WTO. So if there are some countries which are not taking those obligations, the large economies who have reached an agreement, they are called free riders. And that is seen as an unfair situation to perpetuate. We saw this most recently in the views expressed by the United States under President Trump, where he said, if I have reduced my tariffs, so should all the other economies which I want to export to the same level. I mean, that is an extreme kind of perspective. But so first, how do you actually get the issue of free riders out of the way? Second, what are the new issues which are rising? Technology is one of them. The global commons aspect has been there for some time. The digital initiatives and the widespread use of digital is somewhat new. There are some models of agreements, say, between Australia, Singapore, etc., where you can have a digital trade agreement with some framework. It's useful to see what is the framework which can bring about a solution, because ultimately the aspect is you need to get consensus in order to get any agreement as part of WTO. Consensus means that nobody should be objecting. And if one of the large economies or one of the coalition of economies which have a substantial presence at the WTO objects, it becomes very difficult to take the solution forward without addressing their concerns in a very meaningful way. So the US-China issue is a very prominent one. The areas of concern relate to transparency, they relate to subsidies, they relate to competition policy. Some of these issues are already under WTO. They need to be reviewed and changed so as to cover the concerns. Some of them require new disciplines to be made. And in that context, if the disciplines come out in such a way that they work against the so-called perceived national interest of one of the major economies, it becomes very difficult to agree. And that is where what I feel is that there are certain new ideas which need to come up. These ideas could, and in addition to the kind of ideas which were mentioned by Ambassador Bhatia, these ideas need a structure which a substantial part of it is already part of WTO. For example, you have this the principles which gave rise to the telecom rules being included within the WTO. So you had certain principles which were agreed, and then flexibility given to countries to take on whatever they would like to take on, and with a timeline. So one can play with that idea. There are FTAs. Now, the TPP was made into a CPTPP because US went out. Now some countries, including China, are taking an interest there. Can we build up from the FTAs Because, till now we have seen the FTAs as destroying the so-called multilateral system, but they have also been the generators of multilateral discipline and agreements. Can we look for some kind of increasing coherence among countries? When you do so, there's a reason why I mentioned the digital trade agreement, because if you see the framework, it actually provides flexibilities, timelines to manage the change, and if problems arise under pre-agreed conditions, to deviate from whatever you are promising. So to anticipate these issues, and given the fact that due to changes like technology, digital, you can't fully anticipate everything, some of the provisions could be through what in FTAs you have side letters, etc. So some looser agreements. So this is not the hard law, but the soft law part of WTO. So a combination of that is required, but above all, there has to be an intent for the main countries to move from the positions they have started with, and not to insist that that is the only position they will end up with if there is to be a solution. And that requires a platform. And Ambassador Bhatia talked about such a platform. And in that platform, the Secretariat also plays a role, as do friends of the chairs of various bodies and friends of the negotiation, etc. But meaningfully, on the side, the existing part of WTO, which actually provides a lot of solutions to you, and so the SPS, technical barriers to trade, sharing successful practices, etc. Those should also become a focus of the members, so that the people involved, the businesses involved, can see some effort in WTO bringing out some good. So if I want to summarize, is the WTO capable? Theoretically, yes. If countries do not stick to their positions, will they stick to their positions? At present, it seems like that they will. And to that extent, a process needs to be derived where a meaningful discussion with different options, many of them starting with the kind of options which are contained in the WTO agreements themselves, including on issues like special and differential treatment. You have concepts in the Subsidies Agreement, Article 27, which can be married to the concerns which are raised, plus not to get the result right away necessarily. So a transition period, looking at the situations which will result in flexibility required. If that is not done, then I don't think on the negotiation front one can move forward. On the appeal process, since I've taken quite a lot of time, I can come back later on that.
Sure, thank you very much. I think you've given a sense of optimism as well as realism, that yes, there is opportunity there, but it really depends upon the willingness, the political will of the countries. So to pick up on a specific thing that you actually talked about, and it's come up in the previous interventions also, which is the importance of subsidies and subsidy-related disciplines. So we have Peter Draper as our next panelist. He is Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade in the Faculty of the Professions, University of Adelaide, Australia. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Chamber of Commerce's Research Foundation, non-resident senior fellow of the Brussels-based European Centre for International Political Economy, associated researcher at the German Development Institute, and board member of the Australian Services Roundtable. Professor Draper, we would like you to share your views regarding the issue of industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises. We know that industrial subsidy reforms has been one of the thorniest issues today, especially in light of countries like China. How do you see the coexistence of state capitalism along with the market economy principles in the WTO paradigm.
Thanks very much, Rupa, and thanks also to the ICRIER and to the Konrad-AdenauerStiftung for inviting me to be with you today, virtually, so to speak. I think, first of all, and a number of speakers did emphasize this, it's clear that our current geopolitical context is morphing into a systems competition, and that's pretty dangerous for not just the global security system, but also for the trading system. And one of the underlying drivers of that is economic competition, at the core of which is the desire, not just in the US and China, which are at the epicenter of this geopolitical competition, but in many countries and groupings, to, if you like, dominate the economies or the industries of the future. The geopolitical part of this is playing out particularly in relation to dual-use technologies, so technologies that have both civilian and military applications. And at the core of that really is the digital revolution, more broadly, the fourth industrial revolution, and a whole set of technologies associated with that. And so what we see is that particularly China, but also the United States, the European Union as well, Japan, other big economies, are very concerned with putting money into these industries of the future in order to dominate them and then ride the next wave of success. The flip side of this is we're also seeing a range of policies designed to promote decoupling. And so if one thinks, for instance, of not just trade, but also investment. So on the investment side, investment screening, putting up barriers to investment from state-owned enterprises, particularly in the case of the United States, Europe, Australia as well. If I think of the Huawei issue, which played out very prominently here in the Australian context and subsequently in other jurisdictions. And so this issue of industrial subsidies is inextricably linked to the issue of state-owned enterprises, at the heart of which is obviously China's model of state capitalism. But it's not just a Chinese model, and it's important to understand that there are other state capitalist models out there. One could think, for instance, of Singapore in our part of the world, of Vietnam, a range of other countries. Some would even argue that, for instance, parts of India represent a state capitalist economy, and the country I come from, which is South Africa, also has been described in these terms, and you find a prevalence of state-owned companies there. So I think we need to get out of this binary US-China framing of the issue, but that is at the core of it. Now, part of the problem, and this has been touched on by a couple of panelists, is that the amount of subsidies going into the system is not clear, no matter whether you're in China or certain parts of the developed world, I think of the US particularly. So the measurement of industrial subsidies, say, at the level of US states versus the federal government is not clear. So it's not just that measurement problem, is not just a Chinese problem. We need better measurements. And if we don't understand the scale of the problem and the directions of the problem, so which sectors, which firms, etc., that just feeds the underlying suspicion, I guess. And what that is doing, putting all of this together, is it's placing a strain on the WTO system. And it's one of those core issues that Ambassador Bhatia mentioned, and I would certainly agree with him that it absolutely needs to be attended to. Now, we do know there are particular protagonists arguing for reforms to the way in which industrial subsidies are, I suppose, managed in the WTO context. So we have particularly the US, the EU, and Japan, the so-called tripartite grouping, which has put forward a series of proposals to address the issue. And I think for the most part, those are useful proposals. They go back to those foundational principles that Ambassador Bhatia was mentioning earlier. In other words, let's get back to the market economy foundations of the GATT and then the WTO. But in doing so, they set China up as the core target. So industrial subsidies reform is interpreted by China as being a China reform package. And probably that is where the core of the problem resides. But I would argue it's not just a China problem. So we've seen recently, for instance, laying out in the dispute settlement system, a long-standing dispute between Boeing and Airbus, which is in essence an industrial subsidies dispute. It's about subsidies to aerospace, and it's really about dominance of the aerospace industry. That's not a China issue, that's a developed world issue, the US and the EU. If we cast the net wider, it's not just industrial subsidies that are the problem. We also have a lot of problem with agricultural subsidies. Maybe not so much with actual payments of agricultural subsidies, but certainly with the growth of agricultural subsidies entitlements, which has hugely outstripped the capacity of governments to actually spend money of them. But clearly that's a growing problem in the system. And then even more opaque, really, is the subsidies going to services sectors. If one thinks of telecommunications, for instance, as a service, and the kinds of subsidies that are going to not just state-owned enterprises, but a range of other telecommunications companies, linking back to this dual-use technology framing, it's clear that we have a big problem on our hands. And so I would suggest that the part of the solution to anticipate this, we'll get back to this later, Rupa, is that we can't just focus on industrial subsidies. I don't think there's enough common ground in that agenda on its own. We need to widen the frame and look at linking other issues into that conversation. I think later, if there's time, or I can do it now, Rupa, I could talk a little bit about the measurement problem, but I'm in your hands as to how you want to proceed.
Thank you very much. Yeah, in fact, I will get back to your proposals regarding measurement and also regarding what are good versus bad subsidies or some sort of gradation of subsidies. So thank you very much for your insights. And I think a very important takeaway here is regarding not targeting any particular country, because many countries can probably be criticized or fall under this purview of distortive subsidies or at least state-owned capitalism model. And also your point regarding industrial subsidies being intertwined with a host of other issues, including the issue of dual technologies and the new age technologies and the promotion of these industries by governments. So we'll come back to this because I think it kind of means that you have to start looking forward at new rules and disciplines as well, and whether the existing framework will address subsidies in the traditional way that we've looked at it. So I'll come back on this point. Thank you. So our next speaker is Ms. Anuradha, R.V. Anuradha. She's a partner at Claris Law Associates, New Delhi, and heads her firm's practice in international trade and investment law and policy. She also advises on environmental law and policy, including on carbon financing and renewable energy. She has been recognized by chambers and partners and international who's who of trade and customs lawyers as a leading practitioner in her field. She's a member of the International Law Association Committee on Sustainable Development and Green Economy, the Asia WTO Research Network, and the Society for International Economic Law. She's also a member of the Trade Policy Committee of the CII. So Anuradha, you have vast experience in a variety of areas, but let me come specifically to the issue of the new negotiating approaches, the plurilateral, the joint initiatives that we are seeing, the new groupings that are being formed. In your view, how do you think these are affecting the multilateral trading system? And in particular, if you can focus on certain groupings or the issue of domestic regulations, investment facilitation, some of the more happening areas where we have like-minded countries, but not a consensus approach for sure. If you can share your thoughts and perspectives on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Rupa, and thank you to ICRIER and to KAS for organizing and giving me this opportunity to present my views at this wonderful platform. Let me begin actually with the concept, the principle of consensus. This has come up in the intervention by Mr. Rimmele, in Mr. Singh's initial remarks. And to begin with, therefore, I just want to put the concept of consensus in the perspective that I see it as a student of trade law and as a trade law practitioner. The principle of consensus is fundamentally an empowering principle, because what it means is that in a system where economically powerful countries will naturally exert a greater or perhaps arguably a disproportionate level of influence, the fact that consensus is the preferred rule under the WTO as of now means that even the smallest developing country can play a significant role in decision making. But again, there is a fine line in terms of whether the principle of consensus is holding back negotiations and is expressing a different view that needs to be respected, that needs to be thrashed out, and the impatience with actually reaching consensus, driving this force away to the breakouts, the joint initiatives. I would argue that, and I think this is something Mr. Singh had also alluded to, the fact that the WTO does have provisions for breaking situations of deadlock. There are provisions which require, say, the 2/3 majority or the 3/4 majority, as the case may be, in situations where consensus is not possible. But when it comes to plurilateral agreements, and that's and that was again one of the largest themes that has been prevailing over this session. When it comes to the plurilaterals, the WTO rules are very clear. The current rules provide that consensus of all members is important, is a mandatory requirement to allow for any exclusive members-only clubs. And that means that unless all members agree to allow the existence of such plurilaterals, it is not going to be possible. Which brings us to the fundamental issue here. What was the necessity? What was the driving factor for these joint initiatives? And each time I keep looking back at the shift, the transformation that really happened in 2017 at the ministerial conference, the 11th ministerial conference at Buenos Aires, it's difficult to really pinpoint what was exactly the defining factor that led to this breakout of 4 major joint initiatives. The 4 ones, you mentioned 2 of them, the disciplines on domestic regulations and services. There is the joint initiative on investment facilitation. The one on digital trade and e-commerce has been referred to earlier. There's another one on MSME. And there is a 5th on the annual, which is very likely to be launched at the 12th ministerial, and that's the one on trade and environment sustainability and structured discussions, the TESSD. Again, at the outset, to have a binary projection of the joint initiative proponents as the progressives that who want new rules to redefine the WTO and the opponents as the obstructionists is, I think, a little bit of a simplistic narrative, because it perhaps also masks, I would say, some kind of an inconvenient truth that perhaps there hasn't been sufficient commitment among members to resolve the sticky issues of the Doha Round, whether it is in agriculture or services or number. Having said that, the past 4 years have pretty much been nominated by the joint initiatives. I mean, really, if we look at the negotiating function at the WTO, it has really been focused on these joint initiatives. And therefore, I mean, clearly not being part of it, or part of the discussion at all, will have its own costs. Because these rules, at the end of the day, are rules on completely uncharted territories. They are new rules that are getting formulated. Not being part of that discussion will essentially mean that a country hasn't had a voice, a policy choice to actually inform the shape and the outcome of those rules. And these have relevance not only at the WTO, but in FTA negotiations, because again, I think it's always been a cross-fertilization in terms of the WTO and free trade negotiations in terms of the form and structure of the rules. And hence, I mean, I firmly believe that engaging and negotiating and carving out required policy space in any area of rulemaking is a fundamentally critical and fundamentally smarter approach. And I would actually also go on to argue that when it comes to the area of services domestic regulation, this is most starkly visible in the shape and outcome of the joint initiative. And finally, and this is an area which actually started at the multilateral level. There was a constituted dedicated group, the Working Party on Domestic Regulations, which has been painstakingly negotiating the disciplines of domestic regulations. In fact, by 2011, as you would be, many of you would be aware, been following the services negotiation, there was a concrete working draft, and this was influenced not just by developed countries, but by several developing countries, India being a firm player in the entire shape and outcome of those rules. But again, because of the financial crisis, because of rising protectionism, because of various issues, between 2012 to 2017, there was some kind of a sluggishness, a hiatus. And then in 2017, when negotiations restarted in early 2017, it was again at the multilateral forum of WTO. And there were discussions, there were negotiations, but finally, when the joint initiatives on e-commerce and investment facilitation were being launched, domestic regulation also became part of yet another joint initiative. And as we speak, there are close to 64 members, including the US, which decided to participate as of last month, I think. So this is something which has actually spun off. And one of the biggest casualties in this entire set of disciplines being hived out of the WTO, and I would actually argue countries like India not being part of it, has been that the resultant thrust of these disciplines has been associated fundamentally with what we understand in trade and services language as the mode 3, that is trade through commercial presence. And one of the biggest casualties is its extremely weak set of disciplines when it comes to the trade which is conducted through the presence of national persons, or mode 4, which is where countries like India and other developing countries have, again, a fairly higher comparative advantage. In fact, again, Rupa, as someone who's been working in services for so long, I'm sure you would agree that mode 4 has been an area on which there have been extremely shallow commitments to begin with, whether under the WTO or in FTAs. And the disciplines in domestic regulations was perhaps a small anchor, a small fulcrum to have redressed that kind of an imbalance. But that's something which we have, that's an opportunity which has been lost so far. Officially, whether at the WTO or in free trade negotiations, mode 4 has become increasingly a pariah of the discussions. Nobody wants to talk about it. There is a predominant, and I would say a disproportionate focus on mode 3 and on mode 1, which is the cross-border supply of services, which arguably in a post-pandemic world is something which is going to gain more importance, the mode 1 part of it. So again, at the end of the day, in terms of not being in the room for the negotiations, I would say has a cost attached to it, and we really may not have achieved much. Yes, there is the issue of being perhaps a free rider, because the legal architecture of this outcome is sought to be conceptualized through, there is a window of Article 18, so you under the GATS, which means that countries that are participating in the joint initiative on domestic regulation can actually crystallize their commitments in the form of additional commitments. This is likely not going to be possible for the joint initiative on investment facilitation and on e-commerce, but for domestic regulations, this is a certain outcome that is going to come out. Harsha has already raised this issue in terms of, is this an area of concern? I would argue that this is part of the rules of the game as it exists, that the fact that if anyone wants to have a plurilateral, it has to be on an MFN basis under the current rules of the game. And this is therefore a natural consequence. But of course, the devil would lie in the details in terms of whether each of the elements of these additional commitments would qualify as something which is actually more beneficial to everybody. There have been a couple of areas which have been identified as which delves into nitty-gritty, so I'm not going to dwell on it here. I just want to conclude this set of interventions by simply highlighting that even if we were to talk about joint initiatives in other areas, whether it is investment facilitation or e-commerce, or the one that I was talking about on trade and sustainable development, environmental sustainability, that is likely to come, the outcome of it, whether it can actually get structured in the form of an offshoot of the WTO agreement, or whether there necessarily needs to be a blessing from the rest of the membership for an exclusive plurilateral, still remains fairly unclear, and that hasn't really been resolved. So the question I really have is, in terms of ideas to actually push this forward, are joint initiatives really necessary? Were they really the only way out? Or can there be a way to bring it all back? On domestic regulations, I'm fully convinced that there is a window, there's an opportunity to bring it all back to the mothership, the WTO itself. And I would say that the same holds true for the DESSC, because the genesis of it is the Committee on Trade and Environment, where substantive discussions have already occurred. With that, I would conclude this round of my intervention and leave it open for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Anuradha. You've actually brought a lot of questions to my mind, and I'm sure I can sense certain areas where Dr. Singh may want to actually reflect or comment in the second round. Yeah, one very important point that you've made is about not being at the table and therefore being bypassed in terms of the new rules and the new game that's being played, while potentially you may gain eventually with additional commitments or other provisions that come, which will get extended to you. But it's quite unlikely, that if you're not at the table, that some of your concerns and the equitable sort of distribution of the benefits that arise from plurilaterals may really not be there. So you've kind of hinted at that, and you raised some very important questions at the end, whether they're at all necessary and whether we can go back to the multilateral framework and what is the additional benefit we're getting. So I'm sure you'll have much more to say on this. So let me go to our next panelist, Ignacio Garcia Bercero. He is a director at the Directorate General for Trade of the European Commission. He currently oversees activities related to the US, Canada, and the EU neighboring countries. Mr. Garcia Bercero coordinated the work of the EU-US High-Level Working Group on Growth and Jobs, which recommended the launch of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations. He is now the EU Chief Negotiator for this agreement. And during the Uruguay round, he followed negotiations on trade safeguards, GATT articles, functioning of the GATT, as well as talks on trade and environment. So today, Mr. Garcia is going to talk about special and differential treatment. I think all our former speakers have touched upon this issue, the broader context of why this has become a problematic area, and this whole concept of self-declaration and the potential sort of, what should I say, the free riding that countries might be doing using this flexibility within the WTO framework to declare themselves as a developing country and get special and differential treatment. So Mr. Bercero, could you provide your insights regarding the crux of the problem with special and differential treatment and laying out some of the challenges to addressing it?
Well, thank you very much. And I'm really very honored to be invited by ICRIER-KAS for this excellent webinar. And a lot of very important points have already been made. Now, let me start just perhaps by correcting, if I may, my CV. I'm no longer responsible for relationship with the US and neighboring countries. For the last 18 months, I have been responsible for multilateral trade policy and strategy within the European Commission. I would like to dedicate a first part of my intervention to talk a little bit more about the overall context, and then put some initial points for discussion about the special and differential treatment. I think the important point to make is that it is certainly true that the WTO is facing an existential crisis. The WTO has lost credibility as a negotiating forum. It is no longer properly functioning as a dispute settlement forum, and the membership is very divided in terms of the direction in which the WTO should evolve. I think Ambassador Singh has made an excellent presentation about how this is very closely linked to the fact that the world today is very different to the world of 1995. It is different because of the change of the power structure. It is different because of the geopolitical conflict between the United States and China. And it is different because climate neutrality, the environmental challenge, dealing with the global commons is now very much at the center of all the efforts to deal with international cooperation. And I think that if the WTO does not succeed in adapting itself, if the WTO does not succeed in reforming itself, I think inevitably we are going to see a situation in which the WTO will basically totally lose its relevance. That is the challenge that we have ahead of us in the next few years. It is not going to be a simple one. I am convinced that it is not going to be possible to reform the WTO unless there is a real political investment on WTO reform. And to simplify, yes, of course, the WTO is a multilateral institution. Everyone has to play his part. But I think that the 5 key actors for any successful effort at reform is going to be, of course, the US, China, the European Union, India, and South Africa, because of the influence that they have on the system and because of the importance of their views to try to put forward a balanced reformed agenda. Now, a reform agenda is going to have to look, first of all, into how to modernize the rules. Many of the issues on which there's a need to modernize the rules have been mentioned. I totally agree with Ambassador Singh that an approach based on the single undertaking is not going to work. Some issues may be possible to tackle multilaterally, but certain issues are only going to be possible to tackle plurilaterally. And that brings to the second big challenge: what are the acceptable ways, what are the options to integrate those plurilateral outcomes into the WTO? And finally, and fundamentally, we need to find a politically acceptable way to restore a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO with a reform appellate body. I totally agree that it is not possible to have a functioning dispute settlement system without an appellate body. But this is not going to be simple. It's going to require heavy negotiations, and probably at the end of the day, it's going to be part of a broader package. So this is how I see the overall picture. I will be very interested on deepening this discussion in our second round. Let me say a few words about the special and differential treatment and how it links to this question of WTO reform. First, I again very much agree with Ambassador Singh that one really needs to find a different way to discuss about SDT in the WTO. The current discussions which are happening in Geneva are sterile, are not leading anywhere in a way that can lead to making progress. I think if you want to make progress, first, it is much more important to concentrate on looking forward rather than looking backwards. Of course, there's an ongoing debate about the Uruguay round agreements and its SDT provisions. I would say 25 years after the conclusion of the Uruguay round, the key question will be to raise why certain developing countries are not properly integrated in the global trading system, because there have been a very different experience of different developing countries. And secondly, what it is practically that the WTO can do to support that integration in the global trading system. Beyond that, the real question is, what about those areas in which new rules or new negotiations are going to be developed? What is the proper approach to SDT in that context? I would tend to agree with Ambassador Singh that probably at the end of the day, you are going to need to be focused on a negotiation by negotiation approach. It's going to be extremely difficult to get a horizontal agreement on issues like categorization in the context of the WTO. It's going to be very much looking into a particular negotiating context and how you can ensure in that particular context that you agree on SDT provisions that make sense, and that you also, it is very clear that only the countries which actually meet that SDT claim the SDT advantages. I have to say, however, there is a fundamental question which really goes to the core about the change in the power structure of the WTO and how to have a WTO trading system that is still relevant for today. China has become the largest trading nation. It is highly competitive in most areas of the economy. You cannot have a system in which a country of those characteristics still is claiming a special and differential treatment. I'm not saying that China is not a developing country, that's not the issue, but China, in light of the weight that it has in the system, it cannot potentially be claiming a special and differential treatment in different negotiations and to still have a system that works. And it's also a question of fairness that if China, as I think it should, makes clear that it does not intend to claim a special and differential treatment, it is logical that countries which are high-income countries, which are members of the OECD, should not be claiming a special and differential treatment either. Now, you notice that I have not mentioned G20, I have not mentioned India, because it is clear that India is certainly a country that in certain areas should be entitled to claim a special and differential treatment. But that's something that has to really be seen, negotiating context by negotiating context, and it has to be very clear what is the purpose of a special and differential treatment. The purpose of a special and differential treatment should be to identify areas in which countries need some time before they can fully comply with rules. That is the fundamental reason for a special and differential treatment in the WTO. That is the approach that was followed, for instance, in the context of the trade facilitation agreement. And I think what is going to be very important as we develop new rules on e-commerce, and we develop new rules on investment facilitation, to identify what is the type of SDT that makes sense in that particular context. I have mentioned rules because, quite frankly, I think that special and differential treatment is a little bit of a false issue when it comes to market access. I mean, if you look into the GATS, the word special and differential treatment is not there. The flexibility of the negotiating structure of the GATS means that you can always find a balance of interest to result in a negotiated outcome without needing to introduce as such the concept of a special and differential treatment. The same really goes for tariff negotiations. I mean, to be frank, I don't think that tariff negotiations are going to be very significant in the future in the WTO, perhaps with the exception of certain sectorial agreements. But the real issue is going to be in this particular sector, how you find the balance of interest that make it possible to reach an agreement which is seen as being balanced, which is seen as responding to the critical mass. The area which I think is going to be more complicated for special and differential treatment is indeed the area of subsidies, because that is a mixture between market access and rules, and how to define the rules on subsidies that take into account the special and differential treatment dimension is going to be by far the most complicated challenge. We are seeing it now. We are seeing it in the negotiations on fisheries subsidies, where the most difficult issue pending is precisely the SDT provisions. I can come back to that if you want in the next part of the discussion. We will see this inevitably when we move forward, as I think we should, at the appropriate time, on the issues relating to agriculture, to domestic support, and of course the issue of public stockholding, which is very important for India, how you deal with SDT in that particular context. And of course, potentially this could also be an issue when it comes to potential to strengthen disciplines on industrial subsidies, although most likely such disciplines may need to be developed at a plurilateral and at a multilateral level. So I think I will leave it like that. And of course, I'm very keen to further intervene in the context of the next round of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially for highlighting the importance of looking issue-based or sector-based at the concept of special and differential treatment, and even looking at the future issues that we are negotiating, like e-commerce and investment facilitation in that spirit. So let me come back to our first panelist, Ambassador Bhatia. So, you briefly touched upon the interface. You highlighted 6 issues, if I recall correctly. And one of these was the interface between the multilateral rules and other agreements, the global commons, issues of climate change, health, as we've seen in the context of the pandemic. So how do you see the WTO sort of coexisting and integrating some of these concerns into the existing framework, or how does it need to adapt itself in order to address some of these larger issues? And in particular, I mean, what we're talking about is address the issues of sustainable development. In a way, this is kind of getting into what Anuradha also mentioned is, one of the plurilateral areas. But if you could just shed some more light on this and the coexistence of WTO rules with other important international organizations and agreements, the Paris Agreement, for instance, the SDGs.
Thank you. In its first report, the appellate body in US gasoline made a very important point. And that was that WTO law does not exist in a vacuum. WTO is not an island. It is part of a large ecosystem of international law and obligations. And therefore, WTO provisions, WTO commitments must be viewed in that larger context. And this is something which the appellate body has had occasion to come back to in several other appeals. Let me focus on one specific issue which you mentioned, Rupaji, which is the climate change and Paris Agreement. And I will compare it with what the European Union has put forward in its draft CBAM. Now, essentially, the Paris Agreement approach rests on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, based on which countries make commitments through nationally determined contributions. Now, this approach leads to different levels of climate ambition based on historical factors and levels of development. On the other hand, the basic concern of the CBAM is to prevent carbon leakage. And in trying to do so, it essentially demands the same level of climate ambition from the European Union's trading partners. The contradictions between these two approaches are obvious. I'm sure the European Union has very valid reasons for fleshing out this approach because it does not want to put its own trading community at a disadvantage. But the concern of multilateralism, the concern of WTO rules must be, how do you square this circle? How do you ensure that both objectives are met? And if the WTO, the point I was trying to make is that if the WTO does not act in trying to reconcile these contradictions between, say, the Paris Agreement and measures like the CBAM, then the WTO to that extent loses its relevance, loses its salience, and allows multiplicity of unilateral measures to prevail. And that is a sure recipe for the breaking down of the global system. Similarly, let me look at the issue of public health, which is another issue which is occupying us in terms of the global commons. Now, the TRIPS agreement recognizes the rights of members to adopt measures necessary to protect public health and nutrition, consistent with its own provisions. The Doha Declaration of 2001, the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health, made this point even more emphatically. And let me quote one sentence for it from that. Accordingly, while reiterating our commitment to the TRIPS Agreement, we affirm that the agreement can and should be interpreted and implemented in a manner supportive of WTO members' rights to protect public health, and in particular, to promote access to medicines for all. Now, the rule makers in the WTO have done their job as far as TRIPS flexibilities are concerned. The problem is this: we are dealing with a global pandemic. And to tackle global pandemics, you require global solutions, not merely national solutions. So, for instance, the use of this provision by individual members to resolve the problems of shortages of vaccines will not be meaningful because of the international global value chains which sustain the supply, the manufacture of vaccines. So this requires cooperative approaches due to the global asymmetry in technology, in skills, in financial resources, by enabling manufacture in regions which are short of these endowments. Now, voluntary licensing cannot be the complete solution. This is what the TRIPS waiver proposal seeks to address. Now, as of now, unfortunately, I see very little scope for optimism about consensus around that proposal. But if the WTO is to be taken seriously, it cannot engage in meaningless debate ad nauseum while the pandemic continues to wreak havoc around the world. A situation in which less than 2% of people in low-income countries have received one shot of the vaccine, and developed countries are mandating booster shots for their citizens, is as much unconscionable as it is unsustainable. So these are the contradictions that we need to address, and I think the WTO has to come up to the mark on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You've raised a very important point that, where there's so much of divergence in terms of access to essential, not just vaccines. I mean, we're talking of therapeutics, diagnostics, everything. We've seen the importance of supply chains in all of these areas. And therefore, there is a need for a multilateral sort of cooperative approach on various aspects, from R&D to distribution and delivery. Let me come to Dr. Singh. If you would like to comment on what other speakers have said before you, or would like to extend further your thoughts regarding the joint initiatives and the MFN argument, which you had raised in your first interview.
Rupa and Mr. Singh, just apology for intervening. I just want to say that given the time constraint, for us, we might have to change a little bit of format. There are a couple of people who have put questions on the chat box, and some people have raised their hand. So if you could try to give at least 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, that'd be nice. Thank you.
I was planning that. So basically, if we can wrap up, with 3 minutes each for the next few panelists, and so that would take us to around 3:40 or so. That would leave us with 20 minutes for question answers and a small little summary at the end. Yeah, I've been watching the time. I just didn't want to stop. Everybody seems to be in a flow of thought. It's very difficult. Okay. Yes, Dr. Singh.
Thank you very much. Some very major points were made, including the responsibility of WTO. And the problem arises that WTO is a multilateral organization which effectively is made of individual countries. That is the WTO. They together make, wherever they reach an agreement, and there is today lack of commitment to a common cause in many areas. But Mr. Garcia Bercero's points on the way he saw how solutions would come, they answer in my mind certain questions. One, whether the entire membership of WTO wants it or not, the plurilaterals will continue to be part of the future. Second, once you have plurilaterals and different memberships, WTO is not going to be one common framework unless members focus on creating a broad framework within which everything can be accommodated. So you will have different membership, different rules. So it'll be like club of clubs. In that context, people talk about the importance of MFN creating problems for plurilaterals becoming multilateralized, and they are right when they emphasize this. The reality, however, is that there are already ways in which countries can actually implement agreements without MFN treatment. So if you take a look at Article 20 of the GATT, where MFN treatment is similar treatment for countries in similar situations. Or if you see the way standards are applied together, so the non-tariff measures are applied together with whatever else you agree to. So MFN is very meaningful in market access in terms of, say, tariffs, etc. But in the other context, how you implement the NTMs makes it, whether you're following the MFN only in spirit or the word, but actually are you combining the spirit and the word together and actually implementing MFN regime. So in my mind, in the future, to the extent there aren't any solutions within the WTO, there will be plurilaterals and there will be practices which will be non-MFN. How do you then create a condition so that all this can be in a balanced way, in an acceptable way, be made part of the multilateral trading system? That is the key. And that is where I think the specific example of S&D is very, very significant. S&D can be seen at two different levels. One is the very idea that developing countries should have S&D or not. There is a view, no, there should not be a blanket S&D for developing countries, especially self-selecting one. I think this is a bogey, because S&D at one level is a political issue. If you're not willing to grant S&D to developing countries, then you are saying, I want to build a house without a foundation. So first, if you want a solution, you must accept S&D for developing countries. The second thing is how to distinguish the S&Ds who will be the developing countries who are actually subject to the S&D. There are several ideas are already there in the drafts of the Doha round, etc. Not every country is treated the same way. There are ideas. I talked about Article 27 of the Subsidies Agreement. There, even LDCs are not allowed the flexibility of giving subsidies to export if their share in global markets are more than 3.25% for 2 years running. So the China problem can go away, because why are you concerned about China? You are concerned because of the country competing with you. If the market share is large, and suppose you can find a solution based on that, as you did in Article 27 of subsidies. So what Mr. Garcia Barcero said is very correct. Why do you want the S&D? How can you actually achieve that objective? That is far more important than to insist on certain principles. Similarly, the third issue, and this is where Ambassador Singh's thoughts on how WTO is actually failing to meet certain objectives needs to be seen at two levels. One, WTO is part of a solution. It is not the solution per se. The solution to vaccines requires a large effort. However, if the WTO has to enable that effort from its own platform, it must engage in a meaningful way to address the effort, rather than create a discussion which is focused on private gain rather than social gain. And that is where a meaningful landing zone or an agent who is able, and this agent could be the Director General, it could be some group of countries, not necessarily those who have come up with the proposals, maybe somebody else. And that's what was tried during the Doha round, and Doha round, which was stopped at one point of time in 2011, if I'm not wrong. No, 2006, was reignited by the efforts of certain countries, like the new group we have in Ottawa groups. So there were groups like that. They have to work as if they are working for the system, not for nations, because the fundamental principle underlying what was quoted by Ambassador Singh is that the formation of this is presumed on certain expectations. Are you working towards those expectations? If a simple analysis can say no, then how can you make it? The only way you can make it work is some people who constructively work towards that. And there are ways to do it. There are methods to do it. But if the major countries stick to their positions, then there is no way it's going to happen.
Okay. Thanks a lot for your points. So let me go to Peter Draper. I think what we can do is combine the second and third round of interventions given the paucity of time. If you could just comment on some proposals, some substantive reform ideas that you may have, especially in the context of subsidies. We want to address the question of countervailable subsidies and to what extent the existing agreement addresses this problem.
Sure, thanks, Rupa. I'll try to be brief. So the first point is that the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures already provides, I think, a good architecture, but it needs to be tightened, that's clear. It includes, as Harsha just told us, provisions on special and differential treatment. So that's good. It also distinguishes, in essence, between good subsidies and bad subsidies. The best way I think of thinking about that is that those are the subsidies that generate positive cross-border spillovers could be considered good. A few have been mentioned in the context of the discussion today. So subsidies to medicines production in the context of a pandemic would go into my good box. Research and development, typically environmental subsidies addressing the climate mitigation problem, for instance. These could all be considered good subsidies and therefore should be permitted, one would think, because they address the problem in the global commons. Where we're really concerned, I think, is with negative cross-border spillovers, so that destructive competition that I was talking about earlier, and particularly in the context of dual-use technologies, but those kinds of industrial subsidies that are being fed by geoeconomic contestation. So the key point is the architecture is largely in place, but it does need to be tweaked and refined. But there's an underlying other problem, which is the measurement issue. And the real problem there, I think, is we really don't have a good sense of how much, or the quantum of industrial subsidies, particularly, that are washing around in the system, and particularly vis-a-vis the bad types of subsidies. So how to address the measurement problem? I think you need, and I'll put it in parentheses, a legitimate international organization to take the lead. What I mean by legitimate is one that's sufficiently respected, I suppose, by a sufficient critical mass of WTO members. Now, in the context of agriculture subsidies, historically, that has been the OECD. Obviously, the WTO is involved in that too, but in terms of the accepted underlying data on agricultural subsidies, it's the OECD. But that is regarded by many developing countries as the rich countries club. And it's the rich countries that are propagating the reform agenda. So it's not clear the OECD could be the only leader in this context. Could it be a developing country club, so to speak? UNCTAD comes to mind. It doesn't have sufficient legitimacy or necessarily the capacity to undertake work on the scale that's required. What about the World Bank? Probably that would be my default international organization. Dealing with this in the World Bank context, I guess Deepak could really comment on this in more detail, would be complicated, not to put it too fine. So maybe some combination of all of the above. But since the core of the problem is at the member state level, and that the problem is concentrated particularly in G20 members, what I and a group of academic economists are proposing is that the G20 itself needs to come up with a solution, and this needs to be anchored in unilateral frameworks for measurement, drawing on examples like, in the Australian case, the Productivity Commission, which every year releases a report measuring the quantum of subsidies in general that are washing around in the Australian system at federal level and at state level. And they do this for good economic reasons, because they want to shine light on the scale of the problem, and because taxpayers are funding this and those funds are scarce and could be deployed for other purposes. In other words, to anchor this on good economic policy at the national level. And since India will be chairing the G20, not next year, but the year afterwards, maybe this is an idea that India could look to take forward. Other key initiatives, transparency, very important. That needs to be bolstered. There's a range of things under that the tripartite has come up with, which I think are useful. And maybe we need to revisit the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures categorizations of subsidies. So expand the orange list and revisit the red list, so those prohibited subsidies, but also solidify that green list and enable it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Since we really don't have much time, may I request the last two panelists to just give very brief interventions. Anuradha first, just any points that you would like to make, especially looking forward in terms of reforms and your reflections.
Thanks, Rupa. I'll just make this very quick. Actually, I just want to take on one of the points, the very important points that Mr. Draper had made. And I completely agree that there are clarity in terms of transparency and criteria for measurement of subsidies is important. But there was a point that he made in terms of how do you characterize trade distorting subsidies. And the only caveat I'd like to highlight here, Peter, would be that in the context of, for example, agriculture subsidies, there's this growing literature which shows that the so-called green box subsidies for R&D or infrastructure production de-linked subsidies actually do have trade distorting implications. And it is important to address that and not simply put them in this in terms of the fact that this is necessarily or assume that they're going to necessarily be non-trade distorting. That's one aspect. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight, Rupa, was just to pick up a little bit on one of the points that I left midway in my earlier interventions, and that is the new agenda that is emerging for the potentially new joint initiative on trade and sustainable development, trade and environment structured discussions on sustainable development. I think this is a key area, again, where it's actually an offshoot, funnily enough, like domestic regulations, an offshoot of the Doha round of negotiations. There has been substantive discussion already on the table. Again, to just quickly recap what has actually happened on this, there was the Doha round mandated discussions on environmental goods and services, liberalization of environmental goods and services, and linkages of trade and environment. Recognizing fully that we can't resolve all the WTO can't be the panacea for all that is happening on the environmental front, but there are those trade linkages which can be captured. But the deadlock really emerged in the context of what will be the listing of environmental goods where liberalization can be achieved. The deadlock was because of the fact that many of the goods that were being suggested had dual use. They may actually circumvent or defeat the purpose. So one way that needs to be addressed is that, and there's a lot of discussion, valuable discussion on how to, in a far more granular way, classify goods which will actually genuinely be only environmental goods. Another very important approach which India and Argentina, again, almost a decade back had proposed, was to use end-use criteria. That is, use criteria in terms of what are the goods and services going to actually lead to. Is it for air pollution control? Is it for a solar project or a wind project? So that end use itself will be a defining feature for reassuring that there is a genuine environmental purpose behind it. And these are ideas which, again, as I feel that this is an area ripe for multilateral discussions. It need not necessarily be confined to the structured discussions, and the CTE perhaps needs to be revived. And with that idea, I just move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha, for keeping it brief and for the idea of how to look at categorization of products and new criteria. Dr. Ignacio, if you would like to just say a few words, because I want to pick up the questions from the chat box.
Yes, thank you. I will really try to be as telegraphic as possible. 3 points which I wanted to make. We are discussing here a lot about WTO reform. I think we should not ignore that part of the debate increasingly is also about doing things outside the WTO. If you look into the debate in the United States, for instance, you would see that the WTO has lost a lot of credibility as a negotiating forum, and a lot of the ideas is about how to negotiate agreements among like-minded countries outside the context of the WTO. And I would note that the United States is not participating in all GSI negotiations in Geneva. So I think we need to be aware. We are at the crossroads. if over the next 3 years we do not find a credible reform agenda, I think inevitably, the center of gravity is going decisively away from the WTO. The second point which I wanted to make is that at the end of the day, a reform agenda is going to need to combine 3 types of outcomes. On certain issues, it is difficult to imagine that you would not tackle them through multilateral agreements. I think that's clearly the case for DSU reform. That's probably the case for fisheries subsidies, and that's probably the case for issues relating to agriculture, domestic support. So those issues would have to be tackled multilaterally. Certain issues inevitably, realistically, cannot be the subject at this point in time of multilateral agreements. The best solution from our point of view would be to have open and inclusive multilateral agreements that can be integrated in the WTO without generating a free rider problem. And that is going to imply probably looking again into the question of Annex 4 and how to make Annex 4 more operational in practice. And there are going to be areas where you're going to have to combine multilateral and plurilateral components. Everything which has to do with sustainability, how you respond to the pandemic, how you respond to the challenges of climate change. I think it's clear that there's an important multilateral dimension on that. And I would agree, for instance, with Anurara that revitalizing the city should be an important part of the climate agenda in the WTO. But it may be that on certain issues, you also need to look into how to move beyond what can be agreed multilaterally. So there's going to be a combination in certain areas of multilateral and plurilateral outcomes. When it comes to SDT, I really think that the best way forward is to be as targeted as possible and to focus on how we tackle the problem of SDT in the context of individual agreements which are being negotiated at this point in time in Geneva.
Thank you very much. Let me quickly turn to some of the questions in the chat box. How can developing countries develop their capacity to negotiate? Emerging countries like India also need to build negotiating capacity. How can this be done? I'll just throw open some of the questions. Who would like to take that question? Okay. Nobody in particular.
I can take it, Rupa.
Yeah, sure. Very briefly. Yes, we don't have much time.
You know, a lot of it really, and I'm sure Ambassador Bhatia and Mr. Singh will have valuable thoughts on this. But I think from a practitioner's point of view, one of the biggest handicaps is, I think, the absence of a trained negotiating team. We have the absence, for example, an equivalent for the USTR or of the the EU equivalent in form of the DG for trade. So I think it is perhaps important to reconceptualize our organizational and institutional framework for capacity building.
Okay, I think that's a great point. In fact, there are many other issues I think at the institutional level we need to work on. Should the newer issues be kept on hold until concerns relating to issues that require more attention like agriculture are resolved? So basically, should we hold off on things like e-commerce, etc., or what should be given priority? Any thoughts on this? And I think this is related to another question. If there was one reform that the WTO had to undertake successfully, which one would it be? So for such a plethora of issues, what would you really prioritize?
Well, if I might just say quickly 2 points. I think inevitably you are going to have to do both. I cannot see how you can actually conclude a meaningful reform agenda in the WTO without having found a way forward on the critical issues which are pending on agriculture, notably domestic support and public stockholding. But at the same time, I don't see how you are going to find a solution on agriculture if you don't find a way forward to integrate effectively new issues in the WTO, particularly e-commerce, investment facilitation. And again, there's the issue of dispute settlement, which is absolutely critical. The WTO would totally lose credibility unless it managed to restore a functioning and credible dispute settlement system. So at the end of the day, I think you are going to have to develop a balanced agenda which includes certain things which are coming from the DDA, not the whole DDA. The DDA is finished, but certain things coming from the DDA, some way of tackling the new issues, and some way of restoring a functioning dispute settlement in the WTO. And it's not simple, and it's going to require a huge amount of political investment by the key players in the WTO.
Thank you. Yeah, so that makes our task even more challenging. Finish the unfinished agenda, at least selectively, and then also look at the emerging issues while tackling the institutional reform issues. Just a few questions from the question and answer box. These are very specific to India. Is it correct to say that the dropping of SPS conditionalities and other non-tariff barriers can enable success of the multilateral trading system, given their subjective nature? So I think what someone's asking is basically the use of various NTMs and the disguised protectionism that form. Is this something that's undermining the WTO? Anyone? Yeah, Harsha.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. As one of the things which is recognized is that for health, safety, etc. reasons, standards are required. Standards become a barrier, or technical measures become a technical barrier, or when they are applied in a manner in which they restrict trade more than what is in some sense minimally required to do so to achieve the objective of health, safety, etc. And the WTO has those certain rules. You could work more on making them more meaningful or operational. And WTO has mechanisms. And when I said that we should also focus on the parts of WTO which are not negotiations, but the functioning of the bodies, where you can bring your issues, and much of these issues are sorted out. About on average 60% is the view, are sorted out by discussions or by finding out more about what it requires. And we talked about capacity building for negotiations. You need to have capacity building, etc. issues for these issues also. So you can't do away with them. You cannot really dilute them. You can make the processes more meaningful, and those processes and systems are in play. They are in play by discussions bilaterally, they are in play regionally, they are in play multilaterally. So those are the aspects, and there the transparency, and often they require a multilateral discipline framework, but the examples can be taken from FTAs, or often you may need a bilateral platform to discuss them. So it's a combination of things, but you can't do away with them. You can't dilute them.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we don't have time for more questions.
Rupa, if you don't mind, there are two people who have raised their hand for a long time.
Oh, okay.
I think Pradeep Mehta and Deepak Gupta. So do you want to give either of them an opportunity to come?
I cannot see. Yes, sure. Yeah, because I can't see any raised hands, so it's not showing on my platform.
Okay, I think Mr. Mehta, do you want to come in? No, I don't see any response.
Yeah, I think it's showing on yours, not mine.
Okay, then let's move
on. Anyone else? Okay. Yeah, so I think I have a tough time summarizing everything that's been discussed, but let me use Ambassador Bhatia's framework, because I thought that was very useful in terms of just laying out the 6 key points. Well, he outlined one of the main issues, which is the disciplines of the WTO, which rely on certain assumptions and on the role of the state, and that's getting sort of challenged. The interplay of WTO with the global commons, the interplay of the multilateralism and plurilateral approaches, the dispute settlement and its paralysis, the concept of special and differential treatment. We've had a lot of discussion on that, and then emerging issues within which I think digital trade is perhaps the most important. So in terms of solutions, I think it's been sort of interspersed within all the interventions. We didn't have a separate round on that. But what I take away from this is that, there exists already sufficient meat there in terms of the provisions or the architecture in terms of specific committees which are already dealing with issues to address some of these challenges. We don't have to reinvent the wheel and get new provisions necessarily on everything. We can use the existing framework. But the point that Dr. Singh made very clearly is that there needs to be a lot of political will. Countries have to be willing to budge from their existing sort of positions. Some give and take, some leeway has to be there, that if it serves my interest to some extent, and I have some flexibility on my position, it should be possible to use these provisions and the framework to get at some solution. The other big takeaway that I get from this is that we should perhaps not be taking any issue and targeting it at a particular country or set of countries, see it more as a broader issue, then the chances of getting the consensus will be much greater. Of course, he talked about in the context of subsidies, but I think it may be true in many other contexts as well. Then on the issue of special and differential treatment, I think we had a very concrete suggestion, which was on going back to questioning the purpose of the special and differential treatment and seeing who qualifies for it and look at it issue and sector-wise. The other important takeaway we have is that gone are the days of just having a multilateral approach. We do have to take issues, and some will have to be looked at multilaterally necessarily. Some will require a multilateral, a plurilateral, or maybe even within that a sub sort of or a bilateral approach on some issues. I think the other important takeaway is the notion of transparency and revisiting some of the criteria or categories or classifications of things that we discuss. So we need to review. We need to be open and inclusive. And then, of course, I think this came up outside of the discussion in a way, but also how countries themselves need to approach institutionally and reform and improve their negotiating capacity and their, I would say, even the ministerial and so on structures to play a better role in the WTO context. I think these were largely, I mean, if I say these are very broad takeaways, but I think one fundamental thing is that for the WTO to remain relevant and significant, it really has to look at issues not from just a national perspective, but it has to look at things from a global sort of commons perspective. Only then will it remain relevant. Only then can it be meaningful. But that requires major countries to kind of come on board and think of the global common good and maybe play down their national interests at some point a little bit and come halfway and reach a consensus. So I think this is how I would summarize. I have taken loads of points, which I will share with the organizers so that they can come up with more substantive things. I think it's difficult for me to really wrap up the richness of the discussion. And I think that's reflected in the fact that we went over time and couldn't do a third round. If I've left out anything, I don't know, Deepak, if you would like to also mention. Okay, so thank you very much for a very fruitful discussion. And I think we have more questions than answers, perhaps, at the end of it. And thanks a lot for sparing your time, your insights, and thanks to ICRIER for giving me this opportunity to moderate the talk and learn a lot from all of you. Thank you. Thanks to the audience for all their questions. I think we broadly covered most of the questions or the gist of the questions that were there. One new message has come. Yes.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Rupa,
Yeah, so.
for moderating the session. That was a wonderful session. And I would now like to formally thank many people. I would like to thank the Konrad-AdenauerStiftung for their partnership with ICRIER. I would like to thank all the panelists, Ambassador Bhatia, Dr. Harsha Singh, Dr. Peter Draper, Ms. R.V. Anuradha, Mr. Ignacio Garcia Borchero, for very lucidly laying down the WTO reform issues that require great attention today. I would also like to thank them for proposing recommendations on the way forward, which gives us all a lot of food for thought. And of course, I would once again like to thank Dr. Rupa Chanda for moderating this session and making the session lively and engaging. Thanks to our audience for participating in the webinar and asking questions which are of great relevance. We hope to see all of you again in our second webinar, which we hope to hold just before the 12th Ministerial Conference. With that, I would like to announce the closing of this very lively session. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.